Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to my meta overview for the 26th of May. Now, the meta currently is what you would call massively diverse at a lower tier. I think is how I'd phrase that. So basically, there's two decks that are like above everything else in my opinion. Then there's like one deck that kind of tries to get there, and then the rest of the entire metagame is decks that do well against one tier 1 deck and completely get trashed by the other one, which, as we'll see, is a very, very common theme through this list. But anyway, there are a lot of lists here, so let's get started. Now, the first two, for the tier 1 decks, I do have lists for, but they're not, like, especially for one of them, it's not exactly up to date. So, first things first, we've got Mono Red. Now, Mono Red has been doing the best out of any deck recently. It has been rank 1 for ages. If we actually look at the leaderboard, you got... This is astonishing. 2 red players, rank 1 and 2. Props go to a Cruel Tech and Peacekeeper as well. This point gap is insane. That's an 80 point gap. I want to point out, if either of them ever loses a game, I think they drop about 50 points each. So yeah, that's a massive achievement to get 1900 rating. It is an absolutely colossal gap there. So yeah, red is top dog right now. The reason for this is because it has a favorable matchup against Kaainu Blue, which is the other very, very good deck currently. And it is countered by less stuff. It does have a bad matchup against some of the corruption control decks in particular, because they have life gain as well as stuff like Succubus. But besides that, a lot of its counters are not very popular. Things like order decks generally are very, very good against these kinds of red decks, but they've been having some issues, and a lot of them playing Massive Assault as well. This list is not a proper ladder list. I'd have to ask Cruel Tech for his more aggressive list if I want to show that. But yeah, the main key component of why red is still at the top, and it's been like a tier 1 deck all the way through Elfwinter as well. It's been a tier 1 deck for ages at this point. The reason is Burning Rage. Basically, Burning Rage in a vacuum on its own doesn't seem too powerful. The reason it's causing the deck to be tier 1 constantly is because it lets Rage fight against the decks it's normally bad against. So Burning Rage is really good at fighting against these slow corruption control decks. It's very good at fighting through Wisdom Dominion in particular. They can't do anything to it. And against Kaainu Blue, it means you have 2 separate draws that are okay against it. They do have Spell Destruction, but they also can't deal with the early aggro, so yeah, you're generally getting the best of both worlds there. It also helps with order decks a little bit. So there you go. Red is the best deck currently. Now, the second best deck, which I've also got as tier 1, because it is a bit above the rest of the field, is Kaainu Blue. Now, Kaainu Blue is what I would call the most consistent deck in the game right now. Maybe Darius is around there as well. But it's basically a Tempo Wisdom deck with the Might Emblem making everything insane. So what are you really using this for? Well, it's Library Guards and Elf Commander. They come out as 3/4s with 3 speed, meaning that corruption decks have massive issues dealing with it. Then you've got Runelit Incarnate, so if you're playing it's a red deck that isn't massively aggressive, so they don't have multiple 1-drops, things like that. They can't do anything, so all the red mid-range decks can't beat it either. All the bounce effects are massively powerful. Landslide basically makes one-turn heal obsolete, because you can landslide his spells and artifacts, and then he kind of just loses on the spot. So it's just a very, very powerful deck against the majority of the field. It's only really countered by 2 decks. Red, and it's like a 55-45 with equal skill. It might be 60-40 in Red's favor. It's not a landslide victory, pun intended, I guess, in Red's favor. It is favored, though, for the red player. Besides that, Vamp Lamp, that's about 60-40. Not even Vamp Lamp, more just the Wisdom Dominion mid-rangey decks have a decent matchup. And that's about it. The rest of the field is pretty bad against Kaainu Blue, and basically you have to play into Kaainu Blue constantly. Also, there's an elf deck running around that's okay against it as well, but that isn't as well tested. So yeah, those are your 2 tier 1 decks. Now, for every single other deck, we'll notice one of 3 situations. It's either okay against both tier 1 decks, but generally worse against the rest of the field, which brings it down a little bit. It's very good against red, but bad against kaainu, or it's very good against kaainu and bad against red, and that is kind of how the metagame is shaped out. Now, there are a lot of tier 2 decks, so I do have some of these lists, but I'll just be running through the overall builds. So, first things first, we've got Drain Control. Now, Drain Control is a corruption control deck. It uses 1 and 2 heroes, either basic Darius, because then you don't have to run Ancient Wisdom, or Advanced Nepharos to reanimate Succubi. And the deck is mostly runoff, ramping into Word of Pain, Consume being massively powerful with large amounts of levels, Word of Pain doing direct damage, and also Succubi. Now, the reason it's so powerful with Wisdom is you get access to some of the best support cards for a corruption deck imaginable. Namely, New Horizons gets you up to 4 or 5 corruption levels in some cases, which makes Consume and Word of Pain utterly insane. We're talking about 10 life swings against red decks and -5 and then +5 on something. That is about as extreme as you can get when it comes to the New Horizons ramps, but it does happen, and is a massive power up on that. Then you've got access to a couple other things Corruption doesn't have, like instant speed removal and flash freeze, and you've got library guards, which is astonishingly good, and just draw power in general, which is usually the weakness of Corruption decks. And so you just have this perfect supplement of both the wisdom draw power and support, along with the high individual power of each of the corruption cards, as you've got like massive tempo gain through fumes and huge amounts of power from consume and things like that. So you do get the best of both worlds basically. Now, the only downside of this deck is that it's a little slow off the ground. You do need a removal spell basically, and New Horizons is quite important. However, the fact that you don't need New Horizons as a start because you have a lot of recovery mechanisms like Blood Witch Harpy actually means that you can stabilize against red decks and then play a bunch of life gain and beat it. Now, in my opinion, it's the best tier 2 deck, and the reason for it is because it is about 60-40 against red. It's pretty good against red. It is, the reason I say 60-40 is because the dragon decks kind of maul it sometimes, and Phoenix can be a trouble. So it's pretty good against red. It's okay against kaainu. It's a little bit on the weak side. It can just direct burn them out, but it's about 45-55 because of stuff like Landslide. And against the rest of the field, it's about 50-50, and that's pretty much the best you can hope for. Now, the reason it's not a tier 1 deck is because the tier 1 decks are about 60-40 against every other deck, so that kind of is the difference there. But Drain Control is definitely a good sort of just all-around deck. Now, moving on to the next deck, we have another kaainu deck, Kaainu Corruption. Now, Kaainu Corruption is far rarer, but it has a massive lopsided victory against red. It's hilarious. The reason for it is because you can put Blood Witch Harpy under a kaainu, get it out a turn earlier, and it's a 3-4. So basically, you've made a completely immortal flying attacker that clears all of his creatures without actually engaging in combat, meaning you can't just fireball it with a creature combat. So that is ridiculous. The other thing is your other targets aren't even bad against red. Bedeviled Fiend is quote-unquote bad against red, but it's still a 6-4, so they can't even burn it, and it can just chunk them to death. Now, the reason it's a bit lower down is because it is not hopeless, but it's not exactly what I'd call good against Kaainu Blue. The reason for this is because it relies on setup. So, much like any Kaainu deck, you're relying on slow value plays with the hero power, but you're also relying on stuff like Necrocult getting massive value over time to make up for your lack of draw. But if you get landslided, you're basically, you've just traded 1 for 1. You've probably traded about 6 or 8 mana in tempo, which is not good. And you can't get your Necrocult set up anymore for 2 more turns, because you really need it under Kaainu to get it started. So you're stuck. And that's basically why it can't really win in that matchup. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. The only way they can really do it is just by drawing Succubus a bunch, and that's about it. Now, the other weakness of the deck is it has serious lack of draw, and by serious lack, I mean almost 0. Some of them play Word of Pain, but it's not even that good in the deck because it only goes up to 2 corruption levels, and as a result, it can't really keep up with control decks that actually have some form of life gain, like the Dominion ones. Even the control ones as well. Like, Dominion, you can at least rush them down with a Bedeviled or something huge, but against corruption-based control decks, you're in trouble, because if they have draw power, you can't keep up and you just lose. So that's the weakness of the Corruption Kaainu deck. Alright, next we're on to a relatively new but still quite powerful deck that Wisp has been championing for a while. The one I'm dubbing the NC Hatebears deck. Now, the reason I've called it this is, for anyone that's played Magic, Hatebears is basically a bunch of 2-drops that have disruptive effects. And this deck is a bunch of 2-drops, well, 2-mana drops that have a bunch of disruptive effects. So, what are you getting out of this? So, the hero power allows you to play a whole bunch of 2-mana creatures for 1, and you draw off them. So, what's the natural thing to go to? Corruption's I Hate You build, which is Flesh Sculptors and Mesmerizing Spirits flooding the board, and you can't stop them. That's basically how the deck works. And if they get these Mesmerizing Spirits and Flesh Sculptors down, then you just can't remove anything and you lose a bunch of cards, and it's pretty much over from there. You also get access to the green tempo cards, Landslide and Tornado Outbreak, which are huge. And besides that, something which you wouldn't think would be very good in this kind of deck, because zombies from Flesh Sculptor, but it works, Harpy. Being able to play Harpy is actually kind of big. It's a big deal right now, because it gives you an almost auto win against red in a lot of situations. However, the deck does not play life gain, which means against red, it can be okay, but you need to get on the board quickly, because if you don't, you'll just get overwhelmed. And that's the only disadvantage against red. Against kaainu blue, it tends to get tempoed to death, because it can't actually block any of the 3-speed stuff, which is a problem. So, you've got a deck that is about 40 or 35% against one tier 1 deck, and about 50-50 with the other, maybe 60-40 against the red deck. It's not as good as it could be, but you don't run life gain in a lot of situations, and it's okay against the rest of the field. So it's a decent deck to run. Similar to the Drain Control type thing, but a more mid-rangey deck instead of a sort of just creature-based control deck. So, on to probably the most hated deck in existence, but still good. One Turn Heal. Now, One Turn Heal basically has Stall written all over it, and it uses Word of Grace along with a ton of levels to win in one turn by going up to 40 life. So, it uses Reflector to do this mostly, and New Horizons to get a bunch of levels. Now, the reason this deck is good is because it's favored against red, and it's not bad against the rest of the stuff. It's also very good against the heavy control decks. Against Drain, you'd think it'd be good, but not really. The reason is they actually life gain win before you do sometimes, which is funny. But, yeah, it does happen. Against any Wisdom Dominion list, it's an auto win. Against red, it's like 60-40 or 65-35 against red, which is really good. What's the downfall? It pretty much auto loses to kaainu blue. Landslide cripples the deck, and also kaainu blue builds tend to play 2 gnomes, 2 unicorns to kind of catch all the different things that you wouldn't be able to deal with. And, yeah, One Turn Heal plays spells and artifacts, meaning that there are 8 cards in the deck that completely ruin you, and they also play the Enchanted Spring to bounce them. So you're just not going to win. That's basically how it works, and they put on enough pressure that you can't actually just stall forever until you have a million mana and combo from hand. So yeah, One Turn Heal just auto loses to one tier 1 deck and is pretty good against the other. Now, One Turn Heal has been popping up a lot more recently than some of these other decks that I've been mentioning. The reason for it is because Conquest allows you to ban a deck, which increases diversity in that format. Simply because you can ban the... say if you ban kaainu blue, you have a deck that's probably 50-50 against most stuff, and will most likely win a game. On to Zombies! Now, Zombies have been around forever. It's basically just the mono corruption aggro deck. Now, Zombies has dropped a lot. It was borderline tier 1 at some point, but now it's borderline tier 3 in my opinion. It never seems to do very well. It's not the most consistent deck in the world. In theory, it's amazing. It has the best 1-drop ever in terms of the 2/2s, and they just keep attacking. And you've got the hero power to make them relevant. You've got Vermin for red, tons of removal, Consume, which is massively powerful with 3 levels, Word of Pain, Succubus. You think, oh, this deck sounds amazing. Why isn't it higher than you think? The reason is variance. If you miss one Divine Offering with any deck, it's usually fine. If you miss one Divine Offering with Zombies, you're 1 foot in the grave. And if you miss the second one, you're dead. Like, you can't win that game, because you're so far down. Like, it's a mono corruption deck that has 0 card draw, that also uses skill shrines. Meaning, if you miss 2 divines, the game is done. It doesn't matter if they're in a row, it doesn't matter if you miss a land drop, the game is over. And that's the reason why I really don't like Zombies for single deck formats, because it never goes better than 4 and 2. I think out of all the silver ticket qualifiers, how many have we had at this point? 10 silver ticket qualifiers as of recording of this video, 12 later today. We've had 10. and there's been one zombie deck that has made top 4. Out of 40 decks that have made top 4, only one has been a zombie deck. And it's not for lack of trying. There are tons of these decks, but they're just not reliable enough, and it does drop your rating a lot. It's also the reason why you do need to hit luck a lot to get high in top 10 with zombies. You can get into top 10 with zombies, though, I will say that. But I don't think you can get to top 5 with zombies unless you hit luck a lot. And it's just because of that draw problem. I mean, you still have Sanctum and things like that, which are very, very powerful against the control decks. But unless you're against a control deck, you don't have time to keep drawing cards, and stuff like Mesmerizing Spirit just ruins you. Alright. Now, this is a bit of a generalization. Order aggro decks. Yeah, it's a very generalizing point. So, this is made of 4 different decks, sort of. The best performing has been OD, that can either be soldiers, or it can be a more mid-rangey deck that's better against mono red because it has Relic Guard, which is amazing. Also, auto loses to Kaainu. I remember the guy that was playing OD and managed to get top 4 in a silver ticket said he ran into, I think he ran into 2 Kaainu blue players. He just instantly lost to one of them, and in the other one, he did win, but it was close, and the Kaainu blue player drew badly. Like, it's not a good matchup. So, yeah, the main reason for that is because you have 2 mana tricks, and they have 1 mana tricks, which causes some issues. That and dealing with a 3-4 is a problem. You basically need a Ray of Righteousness every single time. But outside of that, against red, you can block all the damage, and you got Namir for incremental life gain, and you got Instill to keep bringing back the incremental life gain with priests, and you just survive. It's also very difficult for red to deal with anything above 3 life, which Order is good at pumping out. So that's the OD deck. Then you've got OC Soldiers, which is a bit more of a generic soldier deck. Good against the control decks, because you've got Restless Tombs. Not so much against a lot of the other decks, because you run out of steam, and they can, if they have 2-3 creatures, they can just deal with the zombies. So it's a bit inconsistent and is a bit worse. Then you got an Order Rage deck, which is very interesting. This is actually, I think only one person's playing it, but every time I play against them, the games are really close. When I'm playing like high tier decks, and the games are really, really close. It never quite seems to get through, but it's always a struggle, which can be said for a lot more. It can be said. Like, you can't really say that about a lot of other decks. So it's evidently good, but I don't think enough people have played it that I can just give it its own separate slot. But it's basically just soldiers running Fireball and Fire Blast and Word of Fire with 2 rage levels to just deal with all the stuff Order can't normally deal with. So you get that burn, and you also get removal. The last one is just Mono Order. Mono Order is a bit like zombies, where you have massively powerful cards. Looking at Balisworn Incarnate, 1 mana 3/3. But yeah, you got massively powerful cards. The problem is that you don't have any draw whatsoever. You also have a silly powerful skill shrine in the form of Soldier's Memorial. That's what generates a lot of value for these Order decks in general. 1 turn cooldown is not a fair thing on a might counter. So yeah, this is what generates a lot of value. But outside of that, you don't have any draw. So you got access to things like Instill, if I can find it. But if you've had to discard some cards and you have to go 3 levels, yeah, you're basically top decking 1 card a turn, which is not what you want to be doing. So yeah, you often just lose to the corruption decks by default because you have to discard stuff, and if they're playing Harpy, they shut down half of the cards in your deck and your hero power, and it gets awkward. So those are sort of the 4 Order aggro decks that are all pretty okay. Although they're more sort of meta choices against heavy red fields than a good deck to just play randomly. Okay, we've got 5 more decks on this list. I told you this is a long list. We're on to Implants. Now, Implants, mostly running Coronis, is a deck that pretty much no one's playing right now, which is kind of surprising, because the Wisdom Dominion Implants deck is actually not bad. It's mostly just, if you look at the aggressive points, you only have 4 1-drops, and that's a problem. It does cause some issues against red. But having the Lifebound from Soul Ravens is huge, and being able to put massive amounts of stats on something works really well against red. Not so much against Kaainu because Tornado Outbreak, but against red it's really good, and against most of the rest of the field, it's okay. Like, it'll get you decently far, which is pretty much all you can ask. The Wisdom Splash, you have to drop Helm for it, but you get access to Force Mage Protector to shield your Ravens so that they can actually start hitting your opponent next turn, which is really, really big against red. Always shield your Ravens, pretty much, unless you really need to keep something else alive. And you also get access to the ludicrously powerful Library Guards, which lets you sustain your draw power. So between Library Guards and Gnome Surgeon, you actually have a decent draw power in an aggro deck, which is a pretty decent thing. Now, as I said, the reason why it's not a high tier deck in terms of high tier 2 or tier 1 is mostly just because of the auto loss to kaainu, pretty much. It's not... Okay, let me rephrase that. I don't think it's auto loss, but it's damn close. If they draw any bounce spells, you're in serious trouble. Also, they play 2 gnomes, and as mentioned with 1 turn heal, relying on artifacts is not really something you can do against kaainu blue nowadays. Okay, on to the Mill Neeva. Now, this is Peacekeeper's deck that he's been piloting recently, and it's interesting. So, he actually got a golden ticket with the deck, if I recall. Although, keep in mind, Conquest is a very different format. Conquest is you can ban a deck and then build the rest of your lineup around the fact your opponent cannot have that deck. So keep that in mind when you're looking at tournament decks for Conquest. If you want to look for good ladder decks, look at silver ticket qualifiers. If you want to look at good tournament decks for Conquest, look at golden ticket qualifiers. You get the idea. But anyway, so the majority of this deck is a... pretty much just standard, almost Demon's deck. Like, you've got the 2 portal in the deck. It doesn't go full 4, but you do have the 2 portal in the deck. Mostly for looping Vulture, which is a funny thing to actually think about. But yeah, it's mostly just for looping Vulture. Deck plays the full 4 Vulture and also the full 4 Deathbound Incarnate, and this is where the hero comes in. So, Deathbound Incarnate, later in the game, when you're trying to close out lethal, will be a 10-10 or larger. And if you use this with the hero power, and they don't have any creatures in play, they're probably dead. And that's basically how it works. Now, the reason Mill is actually quite good right now is because it is very, very good at destroying control decks. I mean annihilating control decks. It's very difficult to win when all of your combo pieces get milled from your deck, in the case of 1 turn heal. Or in the case of Wisdom Dominion, they can't end the game fast enough, meaning that your Deathbounds will maul them. And the fact that you can just play them with Swift and hit means they can't interact with them with Cataclysm, and it's a really, really difficult thing to deal with. Now, the only downsides of this kind of deck, also plays 4 Reanimate, just in case you mill yourself with Nightbringers. Now, the only downside to this deck is it is a little slow in setup. It's not massively consistent. It is a little slow in setup, and has some issues actually gaining board control against decks without level 1 creatures. Now, the reason I say without level 1 creatures actually has nothing to do with Harpy for once. But it's just because Corruption in general can easily deal with the smaller creatures in low numbers. So you've got Fumes, you've got like Nightbringer as a 1-1, you've got smaller creatures. You even have stuff like Insatiable Ghoul being an absolute tank against the other level 1 creatures because of 3-4. How do you deal with that thing? But as soon as you go into level 2 creatures, you start seeing higher speed stuff. And once you start seeing higher speed stuff, yeah, you're kind of stuck, and that's where the fault of the deck is, and that's why it has some issues against the kaainu builds, for instance. However, it is a very, very good tech choice against control decks, and it obviously does its job in that regard. Neat combo, by the way, you can use Landslide and Vulture to effectively delete 2 cards from the board, which helps a lot against 1-turn heal. You put 2 Reflectors on top, and then mill them, and then they're gone. So yeah, you can use controlled milling in that regard. Alright, similar vein, not quite the same, but similar, we've got Portals decks. Now, these are the 4 Portal decks, Demons. Demons has fallen a little bit, mostly because of kaainu blue. So, Demons only has really one consistently bad matchup, which is the kaainu blue decks, because of Gnome, and the fact that they can just bounce your Vultures when they're attacking, and they don't care about milling, and they can usually outpressure your Succubi chaining, and you get the idea. So, yeah, Portal has one bad matchup, and it's to one of the most played decks. One of the most played decks. It's also not amazing as red. It's like 50-50 depending on the draw of the Portal player, mostly. But, yeah, besides that, it's close to the bottom tier 2 in my opinion, simply because the deck kind of beats itself sometimes, unless you're against a control deck. Against control decks, you'll eventually draw a Portal, and then you just loop Vultures infinitely and kill them. But against any other deck, if you don't draw a Portal, which is 40% of the time roughly, or I think it's slightly under that, it's like 35% of the time, you're dead. That's the problem with the deck. That's the entire reason why it drops down, because 35% of the time, unless you're against a control deck, it loses to itself, which is a problem, because without Portal, it's just this mediocre control sort of mid-rangey deck. It's basically a really bad drain deck at that point. You still have Word of Pain, you still have Succubi, you still have Harpy, but you don't have any of the wisdom-based draw, and you're running all these dorky creatures like Nightbringer and Vulture that you can't even really attack with because you're playing Harpies. So, yeah, it sort of loses to itself a little bit, which is the reason it's, I will say fallen from grace, because it was actually a pretty good deck for a time. It only lost to itself last month, basically. But now it's dropped a little bit because of kaainu Blue's rise in popularity. Alright, two more decks. We've got the Vamp Lamp. Now, Vamp Lamp has been an interesting set recently. So we've got two heroes being used, which is Basic and Advanced Despina. The Advanced Despina versions tend to be a little bit more creature-based because you can, get Succubi out of your opponent's deck, and actually got to top 10. And yeah, so you can use the toolbox strats a little bit more, and they're not reliant on lamps as much as they used to. I mean, you still call it Vamp Lamp because they still play both, but they're not playing 4 lamps is the point. They're not going absolutely crazy on the lamps. I think the one that was a golden ticket one was only playing 2, if I recall. Let me look this up. Yeah, Belleron's Despina control deck was only playing 2 lamp and was mostly focused on creatures along with his 2 vampirisms. So they're a lot lighter on the Vamp Lamp set, and they're a lot more heavy on the creatures. The reason for this is because the metagame kind of demands creatures right now. Rage will completely outspeed you if you're reliant on lamps. And I mean, as soon as you play them, you're dead. Because you just can't interact with the Flame Serpents and all the crazy Dragonfires and Burning Rage and things like that. So you have to be more reliant on creatures. So the decks nowadays are focused a lot more on things like Mutant for stalling. If I can actually find these cards. Yeah, Mutant for stalling. You still got Assassin and things like that. You also are really reliant on Cathedral to gain you some life before your vampirisms get going. Once they do, though, when you have creatures in play, you win against the red deck pretty much, which is always nice. So that doesn't happen a lot, though. You do get outsped a lot. However, this deck's Call to Fame is basically its matchup against kaainu Blue, because it has very good ways of interacting with kaainu overall, since you have Cataclysm for the stuff you can't deal with, and if you're playing Basic Despina, you actually can go Cataclysm, Refresh, play some creatures, and then next turn Vampirism, and your opponent is in kind of trouble, because they can Landslide, but then they can't play anything. So you can actually get a board advantage against kaainu Blue, which most decks just can't do. Now, 2 cards that have come up a lot more recently are Karthus and Jin. So let's just single this out. Now, Karthus is the end-all, be-all creature that kaainu players do not want to see. They just don't. It kills anything in the deck. I don't think there's a single thing that survives it. Yeah, it kills anything in the deck outside of a Runelet Incarnate that's got way too large and shouldn't have got that large. So yeah, it kills pretty much anything, and they can't deal with it. It gains life if they attack into it, because it always kills something else. And if they bounce it, you replay it, and you're gaining life, meaning that they're not actually winning the game through these tempo plays. Yeah, kaainu really does not like Karthus, and it really has caused the creature to come up in popularity a little bit. Now, the other big one recently has been the Djinn of Wishes. Now, this is how you fight the Drain decks, because Drain is not a good matchup for Vamp Lamp. A couple reasons for this. Main one is you only play a few creatures at a time, meaning Sanctum rips you to shreds. Also, you have to keep clearing their board, and if they just play 2 creatures at once, you probably can't clear both without a Cataclysm, so every time they play 2 creatures while drawing massive amounts of cards, you have to Cataclysm, or they just use Consume a bunch and kill you. And a good Drain player will also Divine Offering his Word of Pains to avoid Mind Extortion, meaning that eventually he'll draw them later when he has 6 corruption levels and you're dead. So yeah, the deck does have some issues against some of the other tier 2 decks. However, it's very reasonable to good against the kaainu decks, which is nice, and is not too bad against the rage decks. It does get a bit overwhelmed sometimes. So it's actually a decent overall deck. It's also a very good conquest deck. Much like with One Turn Heal, you can ban one deck. This was used in a lineup by Belleron to counter kaainu Blue. He was basically relying on his Rage deck and his Despina control deck to get the leg up on the kind of blue decks. He was also playing an elf deck, which can also get a leg up on kind of blue, because he was expecting, well, everyone's going to be playing kind of blue, right? So yeah, he just brought 3 decks that were pretty good against it. And he ended up winning the tournament, so it definitely worked out. And that's, again, the difference between conquest and single deck formats. Now, the last deck on this list is one that I'm a little unsure about because it hasn't really done much yet. It had one really good finish, and no one else has played it, which is the elf deck. Now, this was a Hermelion build, very, very different to the previous ones. There have been a few other random elf decks, but I don't know, they don't seem to do well. They always seem like a good idea in theory, but I don't know, like I think Pedril did okay with an elf deck, but Rage causes issues, basically. Now, this particular build was very interesting. It's what I'm sort of calling Big Hermelion, because it was an elf deck running 4 Guardians, of all things, and 3 Namirs, because you have to go double level for Hermelion nowadays, which is a problem. Now, this is also a lot less of an elf deck, where it's just using the early game elves with no Nienas, I think, if I can remember this correctly. Let me look this up. Yeah, with no Nienas, and it's less of an elf deck, more of a early game green deck that runs order for that late game punch. And from what I could tell, it was designed to beat the kind of blue decks, and shouldn't be too bad against the rage decks, because you're not reliant on the elves as much, and you have a lot of the stuff that's really annoying to deal with. So it seems like an okay deck. Now, I'm definitely not sure about it, though, because, as I said, I've only seen one person play it, and I think it's the only deck right now where I kind of look at it and I'm like, we need to test that a bit. Whereas with the rest of the field, I think it's a bit solved. But yeah, so overall we have a massive selection of decks, although a lot of the tier 2 decks I wouldn't exactly call viable in ladder play. Keeping in mind there are 3 forms of play. There's ladder play, single deck tournament play, and conquest. These all work very differently. Single deck and ladder work similarly, but they don't work the same way. So, in terms of actual meta for ladder, we've got basically, in my opinion, 5 decks that can do well. And if you're playing some of the other ones, I think you could probably switch and do better, is the point. Mono red is the best one. Then you've got Kainu blue, drain control decks, mostly the Darius builds because they're more consistent. And then I think besides that, you've got the NC Hatebears deck. That's also a good ladder deck. And Vamp builds. I think those are the 5 decks you can do well with on ladder. The rest of the tier 2 decks struggle. And like, if you try really hard and you hit luck a bit, you can get it with like zombies, one turn heal, things like. You can do it. But you probably have an easier time picking other decks. And that's something which, when a lot of people say you can get top 10 with anything, well, yeah, if Peacekeeper's playing a deck for 200 games and he learns the deck and plays it massively on ladder because he plays an insane amount of ladder, yes, he'll get it into top 10. Obviously. Same goes for Cruel Tech and Belleron and all the good ladder players. But chances are it'd be easier to do it with another deck, and that's the point. You've got to kind of make the difference between the player and the deck they're playing. And in a lot of cases with ladder, it is the player, because with ladder, a lot of it is you can either play a decent amount of games with a good deck to get higher on ladder, or you can play an insane number of games with an okay deck. And yeah, you can do that, and it's more down to the player than the actual deck they're playing in a lot of situations. But besides that, if we're on to single deck formats for tournaments, a lot of it is meta calling, and you can actually do this by just looking at the players and figuring out what they're going to play. But generally, again, I think the top 3 are the same, which is red, kind of blue, and then Drain Darius as the third one, although you can go for the Nefaris one a bit more there. Besides that, you've got a couple of the builds that can do it, like NC is okay, the Hatebears deck. Vamp is okay, it's a bit sketchy. Yeah, the rest of the builds are a bit sketchy, because you need to be pretty consistent. Like, it's difficult to hit luck for 5 games. Because you need to win 5 out of 6 games if it's a 6-round tournament, which it usually is. So you need something consistent, and that's basically just the top decks at this point. Now, on to Conquest. Now, Conquest is a completely separate format that works completely differently. It's basically got its own metagame. So Conquest is 2 sets of decks. The good decks that everyone plays because they're consistent, and the decks that people try to screw each other over with because they're counters. That is how conquest works. So the decks that you have to focus on are, say it with me, Rage and Kaainu, basically. Those are the two ones. Then you've got, besides that, you've got consistent decks that can pad out your line out if maybe you don't want to run Kaainu Blue because you're worried about counters, so maybe you can run the Drain deck instead. Keeping in mind you can only run 4 copies of a card, so you can't run both of those decks. So maybe you switch it out for Drain, or maybe you switch out the Kaainu for a nature deck like Mill. So this is where the mind gaming comes in. And speaking about Mill, you've got the counters. So you've got Vamp Lamp, 1-turn heal, Mill decks. Zombies is a bit sketchy. I'm not fond of zombies in tournaments. But, yeah, zombies even can counter some of the control decks. Demons, if you really want to try that, yeah, you can do it. And the point is, you build a lineup that counters what you think everyone's going to play, and then you win. That's how Belleron did it last week, where he basically ran 3 decks that were between okay and really good against Kaainu specifically, and everyone else was playing Kaainu, so he just steamrolled the whole playing field. Now, I think Peacekeeper's run was a similar one. Let's see if I can find Peacekeeper's list here. So yeah, Peacekeeper was playing red, and then his other 2 lists were 1-turn heal and then mill. So he basically made a lineup that no control deck could win a game against, which is a very effective format considering, here's the mind games again, you've got people playing, people that say, I can ban Kaainu, and then they play control decks, and then on the other side you've got mill and 1-turn heal showing up so you can't win a game. And that's basically how you do it. You snipe one deck that you think people are going to do, or you snipe a strategy people are going to do, and then you build your decks around it. That's why Conquest is so volatile with deck selections. Like, it's not uncommon for 16 players to have 25 different decks between them sometimes. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. Like, you can have massive, like, almost every single deck on this list, and probably a few more I haven't even mentioned, will show up in Conquest because people are just mind gaming each other out. But for ladder play and for single deck play, this kind of tier list does work out. But anyway, thank you for listening to my 40-minute spiel on the meta for this month. But if you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, want to ask me any questions about the list, which I'll put in the description, by the way, for those of you that don't like listening to a 40-minute video. Then put it in the comment section below. If you want to help me out directly, there is a link to my Patreon in the description. But as for now, it's been Jotto, signing off.